Last time on Hellblade 2. It's not a good game. Why is that? Oh, go watch the video. So now that my thoughts on the game are out there, now we get to what I really want to talk about, which is the critical response to this game. Luckily though, not every outlet is giving this game high marks, and a lot of YouTubers feel the same way as me, which is good to see, but it makes the divide that much more evident, because this isn't just an, oh, this game isn't for me situation. This is a clear disconnect between critic and player. Now, just on the onset, the articles and videos I show here are not meant to bash the authors or the content creators. I don't want this to come off as a personal attack. That's not what this is. This is geared strictly towards the opinions. And to all of you watching, don't go out of your way to harass these people. Don't do any of that. You do that, you're an asshole, and you deserve what's coming to you. Before we get into some examples, when looking at the positive reviews, there were a few common threads that I noticed. Thread number 1. I appreciate Hellblade 2 for what it is. Now, for any game, you can appreciate it for what it is no matter what genre you're dealing with, and if you want to take that stance when talking about a video game, that's all well and good, but you also have to acknowledge what it is. And what Hellblade 2 is a $50 tech demo that barely justifies its video game moniker. But if you don't view it as that, and look at it like a regular video game, then you gotta judge it like a regular video game. There's no room for rose-tinted glasses here. Thread number 2. There is nothing like this in gaming. I do agree, there is nothing like this in gaming. Thank God. On the real, if you're talking about games that delve into psychosis, there is a game like this, and one that, dare I say, is better. It's called the first game. Go play it. It's also on Game Pass and less expensive than this one. Overall though, just because something is not like anything else doesn't always mean that it's good. Sometimes there's a good reason why things aren't like this. And I think we need to start considering that when we make these statements. Thread number 3. This is a masterclass in presentation and immersion. Yeah, and? Just being a masterclass in presentation and immersion doesn't make a good game. That's just one half of the pie. You still need good mechanics, and most of all, you need to be fun. That's what really matters at the end of the day. So let's get into some examples here. The common thread that every one of these articles have is that they all spend the majority of time talking about graphics and presentation, which if you actually read through them, they're not wrong on any of this stuff, but they talk very little about the combat and overall gameplay. I'll give them credit though. The first example here, IGN, talks about gameplay way more than any other example I have here. So starting off here, in Hellblade 2, the majority of her, Senua's, foes are flesh and bone human warriors. This means that every attack you land feels all the more brutal, which yeah, I agree, it does feel more impactful in Hellblade 2, but for a combat system, there's two things that you have to keep in mind that really make it tick. Impact and flow. Flow basically referring to how smooth it feels to actually fight, which is more important to have in a combat system than impact, although you do need both. As I hope I highlighted in part 1, the first game had this flow, but in Hellblade 2, it has more impact and basically no flow, which is why it feels so rigid and monotonous to play. Perfect example of both of these put together. Stellar Blade earlier this year. The game flows so well when you get into a groove with the combat, but every single blow you have feels so impactful. You literally feel every single move and every single hit you take on an enemy. The flow of combat is there, it's fun to play, but the impact is also there, and it feels like you're hitting the enemy with an absolute buzzsaw. Now, these are two completely different games in two completely different genres. That's not lost on me, but this just goes to show you that you can have both, and it's gonna work out pretty well for you if you got it. Now we move on to this part. Timing is also now more key to performing successful parries relative to the original, and the window in which to do so has been shortened to the point where I wasn't just able to calmly deflect each and every enemy assault with Jedi-like consistency anymore, which I agree. That made each fight feel like a little less of a foregone conclusion. See, here I would disagree because even though the parry window is smaller, you could still time it right, and when you do, most of the time it's gonna be an insta-kill. So it's not like the first game where you still had to whittle down the enemy's health after you parry. And also, like I said in part 1, you will rarely die in this game. I died once, maybe twice in Hellblade 2, where I was dying way more in Hellblade 1. Not because I'm some combat aficionado, but because everything's just more simplified, and outside of the torch guy, no enemy is really gonna test you. So in many ways, combat does feel like a foregone conclusion, even more so. Now here's where we get interesting. That said, while I remained consistently engaged in each ferocious and remarkably fluid fight to the death, I do wish the team at Ninja Theory had done a little more to build upon the fairly modest combat template established in the original Hellblade with what they've served up here. I agree! Admittedly, Hellblade 2's swift 6-hour runtime leaves little room to cram in a skill tree to flesh out or additional attack combos to unlock, but it does feel a touch familiar to play through another campaign with the same basic 2-button mix of light and heavy sword slashes, as superbly animated as they may be. You see, even IGN agrees, and this is another common thread I've seen in these articles and with these people who give this game high marks. You cannot praise any aspect of gameplay without there being some sort of caveat. You will rarely hear someone say flat out, the combat is good, or the puzzles are good. There's always that, the combat is good, but it is fairly limited even from the first game, which is crazy that that's something that these critics just gloss over without a second thought. If anything, Hellblade 2's fighting feels even further streamlined than the original, where Senua also had a guard-breaking melee attack that's been dropped entirely with nothing to replace it. Meanwhile, her slow-motion focus ability, which was unlocked midway through the original Hellblade, is made available in the sequel virtually from the outset, with no further attack-altering abilities to be found for the remainder of the story. Hellblade 2's combat encounters are consistently menacing and muscular as new enemy types like flame-spinning cultists and nimble ghouls are introduced. I'm just gonna stop you right there. Just because the movesets and designs are slightly altered, you're still fighting enemies the same size as Senua, and you use the same approach for most of them. There's nobody bigger than her like in the first game, especially those giant, bulky axe boys. It made you feel more intimidated. In fact, I think every single enemy in the first game was bigger than her. What happened? You couldn't get anybody over 6 foot to mocap for you? Honestly, that's probably the reason. But without any additional charged attacks or alternative weapons to wield, my basic methods for overcoming each marauding mob remain mostly unchanged from start to finish, even on the hardest difficulty setting. Does it feel good to be right or what? But this next part right here is the reason why I wanted to include this in the video. One combat change that I did appreciate, however, is the way Hellblade 2 limits each duel to one-on-one encounters. With no HUD to indicate incoming attacks and the whispers of warning from the voices in Senua's head easily missed during the heat of battle, in the original Hellblade, I often found myself getting stabbed in the back by an unseen off-screen assailant whenever I found myself outnumbered. Thankfully, that's no longer an issue here.
Say what?
That's no longer an issue here? That was an issue for you? I admitted in part 1 that the camera would get wonky sometimes, but I don't think that's what you're referring to here. It looks like you're saying that the fact that there were multiple enemies on screen was the issue for you. But it wasn't cheap. That was the only thing in Hellblade 1 that gave it any semblance of difficulty. In what world do you think that's a problem? Look, I don't want to turn this into a games journalists aren't good at video games talking point, but if I had to admit evidence to a judge...
Goodbye. Case is dismissed. That's all.
This next part in the article, they basically just give an overview of the puzzles. They kind of talk about it, give it like a general overview, and say like there's more variety and different things like that. But it's this part here that really starts to get me questioning things. None of these environmental riddles are particularly taxing though, and for the most part, Hellblade 2's puzzles have seemingly been designed to momentarily stall Senua's forward march rather than ever truly stump you.
Do you see the problem here?
So you just admitted that the puzzles are there to momentarily stall your forward march, aka pad the runtime, rather than actually provide a challenge? That's a problem, dude! It's a massive problem. If the puzzles aren't providing a challenge, you need to call that out more. You don't just gloss over that. So in this review, for the two most important, actually, the only two functions of gameplay, the writer says that the combat system is more streamlined and he wishes it wasn't, and the puzzles don't provide a real challenge and are there to pad the runtime. You know who said the same thing?
Me!
But you still give it an 8 out of 10. Does presentation really hold that much weight to you? We then move on to Eurogamer, who gave the game, of course, 5 stars. So if we scroll down to the gameplay section, let's take a look and see what they have to say. From a structural perspective, the core experience of Hellblade 2 is largely unchanged from the first. Senua's world is a series of puzzles, many of which hinge on tricks and perspective, interspersed by abrupt combat encounters and intense periods of hallucination. The puzzles are, for the most part, periods of calm and reflection. You see, with this sentence here, which the writer expands upon in the back half of this paragraph, he doesn't recognize the problem with this. When 75% of your game is walking, which in and of itself are periods of calm and reflection, you can't have integral gameplay aspects also be periods of calm and reflection. Otherwise, it's just gonna get boring. You need to ramp things up and force people to use their brains, which unfortunately, Hellblade 2 doesn't do. Which, by the way, speaking of, they're not overly challenging, but still provide a sense of satisfaction when the solution becomes clear. I don't know why everybody says this. Yes, it's not particularly hard. You can pretty much breeze through it. It's not really challenging, but you know what? I still liked it. It amazes me how none of you guys see this as a problem in a 5-hour video game. If a puzzle is not overly challenging and you can go through it pretty easily, then it's not a puzzle, it's just tedium. Alright, now scrolling on down to combat. As in the first, combat encounters are all about timing. Learning to dodge and parry attacks at the right moment is key, with perfectly timed blocks filling up a gauge that allows you to slow time and deal a flurry of attacks to your adversary. It's fairly forgiving. Senua can tank a surprising amount of damage, and the game is quick to get you back into the fight on the rare occasions you do actually fall.
You see, Lord? He admits it himself.
Love how Eurogamer just straight up says, yeah, the combat's not hard at all. Yeah, for everyone who thought I was crazy for saying in part 1 that you will rarely die, and who thinks I'm nuts for saying combat is easy and a foregone conclusion, Eurogamer, who gave the game 5 stars, just said everything that I said.
What's up now, bitches?
So if we actually scroll down, there's another combat paragraph. I don't know why these are split, but okay. But in this part, it's basically talking about combat animations and how everything has more weight to it, which, again, I said earlier I agree with, but it's this sentence right here in this section that I really want to hone in on. The camera responds to crushing blows and shifting tides with real weight, providing a sense of heft to battle that rivals even the best that God of War has to offer. You're on crack, my guy. In doing so, it wrests a good deal of camera control away from the player, and arguably puts each set piece firmly on rails. But the payoff is electric. I don't even know where to begin with this sentence. Whenever you see wrests camera away from the player and on rails in the same sentence when describing something about gameplay, that should automatically disqualify it from being a positive in that case. It's called gameplay, not game watch. Now, it may work if the combat itself was good, but as we firmly established, it's not. So now we switch over to YouTube and talk YongYea. Now, Yong's review was one of the first ones to go up on the platform, and I like YongYea. I've watched him for years. I genuinely like his content.
F off, EA.
But I mean, if you couldn't tell, I have major problems with his review here. So he starts off his video just talking about the runtime, and this is what he has to say.
It's up to you to decide whether paying $50 for a roughly 7 to 8 hours long experience is worth it, but what I can tell you is that these are 7 very high quality art housey hours. There's no fat here, it's just a really nice lean 7-ounce piece of filet mignon where every bite is chef's kiss.
I'm sorry?
A nice 7-ounce piece of filet mignon where every bite is chef's kiss? If you're talking strictly graphics and audio, then yeah, Hellblade 2 is filet mignon if we're talking highest quality. But if you're talking about the overall game, I can assure you, buddy, Hellblade 2 is not filet mignon. It's Asmongold's $2 steak. Also, another thing that he says there's no fat here. I could just point to the 3 examples I gave in part 1, the underwater section, the torch lighting in the cave, and the crevice crawling part, which took over 3 minutes. Yeah. No fat my ass, but he continues.
There is combat in this game that feels noticeably improved from the last entry with encounters that can offer a bit of a challenge.
Disagree on both points, but before he goes further, he talks about all aspects of gameplay, and I want you to listen to how he explains this, and see if you can find the common theme here.
But from a purely mechanical standpoint, it's a pretty simple affair involving few variations of light and heavy attacks, blocks, dodges, parries, and a bullet time ability. At the same time, the combat mechanics are engaging enough for the game's shorter run, and the way combat is so cinematically presented makes every encounter really exciting and riveting to behold, makes every one of them count. But these puzzles do overall feel pretty rudimentary. They don't offer a whole lot of challenge, and their concepts aren't pushed as far as I'd like. At the same time, though, their visual and auditory splendor and the narrative elements infused in them still make them interesting to engage with. But the vast majority of the time, you will be walking in a predetermined path with little room for deviation. At the same time, though, navigation is still compelling because existing in this setting and just looking around at the vistas they've crafted here can be so captivating in its own right.
With those 3 sections, did you notice the common thread between all of them? Yep, they look great. Combat isn't as fleshed out, but it's very cinematic. Puzzles aren't hard, but they look and sound great. You're going to be walking a lot in Hellblade 2, but everything around you looks beautiful. So because everything looks great, that excuses the game's shortcomings with its gameplay. I'm sorry, Yong. That's not how this works. If I'm not having fun and I'm not engaged with the core systems, then it doesn't matter how great or cinematic something looks because that's not what I'm there for. By the way, this review is a little over 15 minutes long. He starts talking about gameplay 9 minutes into the video, and it lasts 2 minutes and 18 seconds. So out of this 15-minute review, only 2 minutes are spent on gameplay. Now, he says in the video that it's a very presentation-driven game, and that's why he spends so long getting to the gameplay part, but if 2 minutes is all it takes for you to say your thoughts on the gameplay side, therein lies the problem. Gameplay should never take a back seat when assessing one's opinion on a video game, but there's one thing that Yong says in this video that perfectly describes this game and pretty much reinforces my feeling of it. Take it away.
This is not the kind of game where you are the director of your own journey. It's a game where the director takes you on theirs because they want to share something with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
If you recall what I said in my gameplay versus presentation video a while back, this is how video games differ from movies, because a movie is an experience you sit down and watch as they take you on this ride. But in video games, you control the ride. So using my logic that I set up all the way back then, you admit, this is a goddamn movie. We now move on to Hardcore Gamer, which of course gave the game a 5-star rating. As you'll see with most things today, they only have 1 paragraph dedicated to combat and overall gameplay in this game. And this is what they say. Combat in Hellblade 2 is designed to be simple to learn but difficult to master. Players are encouraged to adopt a slower, more thoughtful approach to combat. More thoughtful? What are you talking about?
You don't know what you're talking about, do you?
I literally said in part 1 that there's less thought that goes into the combat because you have less things to worry about. The only thing you have to worry about is attacking and dodging. You're not worrying about enemies backstabbing you, you're not worrying about managing your focus, and you're certainly not worrying about dying more if you've been listening this whole time. Of course, there's no explanation as to why it's more thoughtful because he doesn't have one. The puzzles, level designs, and settings are intricately crafted, contributing to a cohesive and engaging gameplay experience. What? What? Would you care to expand on this more? No? Okay. Next, we got Cog from Defining Duke. Now, for those of you who don't know, Defining Duke is an Xbox-centric podcast, and before you groan, these guys are not shills. I like everybody involved here. Maddie's great, Cog seems like a genuinely good guy, I like the guests they have on most of the time, and Maddie actually echoes the same thoughts I have on Hellblade 2. But Cog's view of the game takes on the same format that a lot of these articles do. His approach feels like he's viewing this as a cinematic experience and a story rather than a video game. And I'll have the video and the timestamp from where he starts talking in the description. In fact, everything I reference in this video will be linked in the description. But there's a few things he says here that made me do a double take. Exhibit A.
But what I will say is we're at this level now when I'm playing the game and I'm thinking, oh, this is time for the cinema. Let me put the control there. And they like, no, bro, get in there and do that. Get in there and crawl between the ship levels.
Correct me if I didn't hear this right, but did you just praise a game for having the ability to crawl through spaces? The ability to actually do something when it looks like a cutscene? Look, just even if you are impressed by the fact that you could do something when it looks cinematic like this, and it throws you off for a second, you're only pressing the control stick forward. You're not doing anything drastic here. That's not really something to be impressed about.
For me, it was so different because I looked at it as, wow, this is them delving into horror. When you the whole thing with the hidden folk, to me, that was the part where I go, wait a minute. We're using lighting to keep ourselves alive. There's a pool of very horrifying things that I don't want to interact with. And the sense of claustrophobia, it showed me Naughty Dog was kind of getting their chops as far as what they could do with horror. That's why I said with Project Mara.
Before you rip on him, he meant Ninja Theory. He just slipped up. So here he's referring to the torch lighting section, but let me stop you right there. You're saying this section worked for you because you interpreted it as a horror section? That made up for the fact that you're doing nothing but pushing up on the control stick and lighting torches because we need something to justify the video game moniker? Really? That's all it takes? And by the way, let's say this was them delving into horror. They failed entirely. I wasn't scared at all throughout this section. Was anybody scared with this? Let me know in the comments if you were. So then he talks about the section that was in the gameplay trailer they showed at the Game Awards with the giant. Here's what he says about that.
I'm like, all right, is that real? Are you doing that? No, you're doing that. I'm like, okay, then you're running back and you're doing it. And it was the whole scale. I'm like, that. They did everything that they showed in that trailer, and I got to control it. But for me, they delivered on every aspect of it, and a lot of it was controllable.
Tell me he did not just say that.
Oh my god, I am really starting to lose sympathy for these people. You run straight back, watch the cinematic, wait a bit, and you press a button. That's all you do. You don't move Senua around. You don't aim the spear. This is all that you do here. You know what this is? This is a quick time event without the button prompt. And you think this deserves praise? This is the bare minimum. Yeah, they did deliver on what they showed. The problem is, it wasn't good. Last thing from COG, and then we'll move on. Just take a listen to this.
If you are doing things in your weight class in sound, graphics, and again, the way you tell a story, and no one else can do what you're doing, I think you're in a class of your own. Now, you may say, I don't like the complete package. That's fine. But until you can compare anything one-to-one with this style, there's nothing like it. It's such a unique anomaly. It's a package. To me, Hellblade 2 is a genre of its own. The Hellblade series is a genre of its own.
I'm going to tell you a dirty little secret here. Other studios can do what Ninja Theory does. They just don't do it because they have other things in their games to worry about, like gameplay, mechanics, progression. Do you really think a studio like Santa Monica or Insomniac or Capcom can't reach this level of graphical fidelity and motion capture? Do you really think those million and billion-dollar studios can't get to this level? Of course they can, but they don't because they get it just enough where they can have that realism look so they can focus on making their video games function like, you know, actual video games. If you're developing a game for 6 years and you're focusing on nothing but presentation, yeah, it's gonna look pristine and above everyone else because that's the only thing the entire studio's been working on this whole time. The problem is, nobody's working on the actual video game part, so it's gonna suck. That's why these other studios don't do it. So let's hop over to Twitter. Let's see what's going on over there, shall we? I just beat Hellblade 2, an unforgettable masterpiece. 10 out of 10. 17 hours and 21 minutes? What were you doing, buddy? This has to be a troll. This has to be a troll. There's no way. 17 hours in a 5-hour game. No, there's not. There's no way. There's absolutely no way. I'm losing my mind right now. Okay, next up. This next one comes from Paris Lilly. He's a Xbox podcaster. He's appeared a few times on Kinda Funny. This is what he's got to say. In my opinion, we focus so much on what's wrong and not enough on praising what's right. That's not your job, buddy. As a video game critic or commentator, your job is to assess a game by its strengths and its weaknesses. If a game has serious flaws, you have to call it out, not just ho-hum it and just go on to what makes you happy. That's how we get mediocre games. And before anyone says anything in the comments, this isn't just a plain statement he decided to make on his Twitter one day. This is in response specifically to his Hellblade 2 review, where he gave it an 8 out of 10, because he gets called out on it in the replies and he defends himself. If it didn't have anything to do with Hellblade, he would just say, oh, that wasn't what I was referring to. I was watching Luke Stevens talk about this, and he made a pretty good point where he said that as a reviewer, you could sometimes lose sight of the value proposition of a video game when you get review codes for free all the time.
He took my thing.
And I completely agree. You can afford afford to be an optimist when you have no financial risk in getting a game, but you have to remember that everybody else can't be, because they have to get the game through Game Pass, which they pay a subscription for, or God forbid, they pay $50. But last but certainly not least, I give you the most egregious review of this game, GamesRadar. In this article, this official review of Hellblade 2, there is not a single mention of gameplay in this entire thing. Matter of fact, if the chart in the beginning doesn't concern you, do a Control F right now and type in combat. You get 2, and none of them are even referring to mechanics. But what about the puzzles? They can't possibly not talk about that, right? We see this reflected in the range of environmental puzzles, marked varied from those in Hellblade Senua's Saga. Not even the correct title for the game, but alright. That turned this dark fantasy adventure into a sophisticated narrative experience. Alright, but what about the actual puzzles? What are your thoughts on those? Are you gonna explain this at all? Nope, we got a problem. Greater stress is placed on world exploration in this sequel, foregoing the maze-like cyclical pathways of the original game in favor of an interconnected series of villages and locations. What? Interconnected? What are you talking about? This isn't Dark Souls. There's no interconnected series of villages. What? That's just a straight up lie. Oh yeah, and the other time they mentioned puzzle again, nothing to do with actual mechanics.
Good, great, grand, wonderful.
I was trying to be as respectful as I can with all of this, but this review is unacceptable. If this was an op-ed talking about the depiction of psychosis in Hellblade 2 and how the graphics and audio contribute to that, fair game, but this is the official review for GamesRadar, and there's not one mention of gameplay. If I was the editor-in-chief and this came across my desk, I would send it back immediately. No, Jasmine, you're not done yet. I've never seen anything like this, and I hope this is the last time that I do. But I'm not holding my breath. So, we finished the critical response, but there was still that question I had when I looked into all of this. Why would critics gloss over gameplay aspects that clearly have major flaws and are objectively worse in most areas from the first game? And there were 2 reasons I could think of. Number 1, which is the most likely, they're distracted by the visuals and it makes the game seem better than it actually is. I know this happens because it happened to me. When I saw Avatar: The Way of Water, I walked out of that theater thinking that was one of the best movies I had ever seen. It was visual heaven, everything looked beautiful, and I was mesmerized. But after a few days I thought about it and then I was just like, yeah, that story wasn't actually that good. This stuff is bound to happen, but as a critic, it is your job to cut through all the bullshit and judge the cake underneath all this icing. And I think a lot of critics fell for this trap this time around. Reason number 2, and I hope this is not the case, these critics know the game has major flaws, but don't want to talk about it more, because if they do, that would mean they would have to lower their review scores, and lower review scores make it more likely that Xbox will shut down Ninja Theory, given what just happened with Tango and Arcane. And they obviously don't want that, which I hate to break to you guys, might happen whether you want it to or not. Which, by the way, this entire time, I've never even brought up Xbox's situation because I don't think it matters here, but that should not be affecting the way you view this game at all, and I hope it's not here. But here we come to the end, so thank you guys for bearing with me through all this. I talked about Hellblade 2 way more than I wanted to, and way more than anyone should, but we're finally at the end. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go start a new Elden Ring playthrough so I can play Shadow of the Erdtree when it comes out this Friday, and you all should do the same. Peace out, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for watching.